When people ask, why doesn't inflation in the United States go back to normal faster? They usually mean something very specific. They're not talking about charts. They're not talking about decimal points. They're talking about the feeling they get at the checkout line, the rent notice, the insurance bill, the groceries that somehow cost more even when the headlines say inflation is cooling. And here's the first uncomfortable truth you have to swallow before any of this makes sense. Inflation coming down does not mean prices go back down. If inflation falls from 4% to 2%, prices are still rising. They're just rising more slowly. The level never resets automatically. That's why you can have a year of good inflation news and still feel like the economy is squeezing you. Your brain remembers the old price level, your paycheck remembers the old purchasing power, and your life remembers the moment when normal stopped feeling normal. Now keep that in mind because it sets up the real question for 2026. Why is the last mile of inflation so stubborn? Why does it refuse to glide neatly back to the central bank's target the way textbooks imply it should? I'm going to give you the real reason, but I'm not going to do it with slogans. I'm going to do it the way the economy actually works, through incentives, delays, and constraints. And if you stay with me to the end, I'll tie it all together into one simple framework you can use to read inflation headlines without being manipulated by them. Let's begin with what most people miss. Inflation isn't one thing. It's a bundle of different fires burning at different speeds in different rooms of the same house. One room is goods: TVs, laptops, furniture, cars, anything that can be manufactured, shipped, and scaled. Goods inflation can cool relatively fast because global supply chains, competition, and technology can respond quickly. When demand falls or inventories pile up, prices can get discounted. That's why you'll sometimes see electronics get cheaper, even when you feel like everything else is getting more expensive. Another room is services: healthcare, childcare, dining out, repairs, education, entertainment, and the labor behind almost everything you do. Services inflation is slower and stickier because it's powered by wages and local constraints. You can't offshore your haircut. You can't mass produce a dental appointment. You can't suddenly build a million new daycare slots in 6 months. And then there's the room that matters most for how Americans experience inflation: shelter, rent, owner's equivalent rent, housing costs, and housing related expenses. Shelter is not just another category. Shelter is a weight. It's an anchor. It moves slowly, and when it moves the wrong way, it makes everything feel heavy. And shelter inflation tends to lag real-time housing conditions because leases renew over time, not instantly. Housing is a slow market with long contracts, long construction timelines, and long memories. So right away, we have the first answer to why inflation doesn't normalize quickly. The parts of inflation that cool fast already cooled. The parts that cool slowly are now the ones doing the talking. That's the last mile problem. In the early phase of disinflation, you can get quick wins. Supply chains untangle, shipping costs fall, excess demand fades, discounting returns in goods. The headline inflation number starts behaving. Then you hit the last mile: services and shelter. And the last mile is where inflation turns from a supply chain story into a social structure story, a labor market story, a housing story, a political story, a credibility story. Now, here's where the conversation gets serious, because the second reason inflation doesn't return to normal quickly is psychological, but not in the way you think. Inflation creates a new set of expectations, and expectations change behavior. Once the public has lived through a burst of inflation, everyone becomes more sensitive. Workers negotiate differently. Businesses set prices differently. Landlords renew leases differently. Consumers accept different normal price increases, even while they complain about them. And that behavioral shift doesn't reverse overnight. Imagine inflation like a crowd at a stadium. When panic spreads, people stand up. Once everyone stands, you can't see unless you stand too. Even if the panic calms down, people don't instantly sit. Some stay standing because they don't trust the calm. Some stay standing because they're afraid of missing something. Some stay standing because now it's just how it is. That's what inflation does in an economy. When input costs rise and everyone has successfully raised prices for a while, businesses learn that price resistance is weaker than they thought. They build more frequent price updates into their habits. They shorten the time between adjustments. They become less afraid of customer backlash because they can always point at the economy as the villain. And once that habit is established, it doesn't disappear just because the inflation chart looks nicer for a quarter or two. But even that isn't the deepest reason. It's just the surface. The deeper reason inflation doesn't normalize normalize quickly in the US is that inflation is no longer purely a monetary phenomenon in the old-fashioned sense. It has become a regime phenomenon, a system-level outcome of how the US economy is now designed to function. Here's what I mean. For decades, the implicit bargain was simple. The Federal Reserve fights inflation, and the fiscal side of government tries, at least in theory, to keep long-run deficits under control. But the modern reality is different. The US has normalized large, persistent deficits, even during periods of economic growth. That matters because persistent deficits inject demand into the economy on a recurring basis. They don't just stimulate during recessions, they stimulate during normal times. That extra demand can keep parts of the economy hotter than they otherwise would be. Now, in an ideal textbook world, the central bank can offset that by tightening financial conditions, raise rates, reduce its balance sheet, slow demand, cool inflation. But the real world has constraints. When debt levels are high, higher rates don't just slow the economy. They raise the interest burden. They increase the government's debt service costs. They pressure budgets. They affect political tolerance. They shape what policymakers are willing to endure. This is where you start hearing a phrase that matters in 2026: fiscal dominance. Fiscal dominance doesn't mean the central bank is taking orders. It means the size and structure of fiscal commitments change the practical boundary of what monetary policy can do without creating a political or financial crisis. The Federal Reserve can raise rates, yes, but it cannot raise rates to infinity. It cannot hold tight policy forever if the financial system starts cracking, if unemployment jumps sharply, or if credit markets seize. So if the underlying system keeps generating inflation pressure through housing scarcity, service sector wage dynamics, and persistent demand injections, the central bank is forced into a balancing act. And balancing acts tend to produce inflation that declines slowly, unevenly, and with frustrating pauses. That's why back to normal is slow, because normal is no longer the old normal. Now let's get even more specific, because people keep asking in 2026, if inflation cooled so much compared to the peak, why does it still feel like it's not done? Because the inflation you feel is not the inflation that's easiest to kill. You feel housing first, you feel insurance, you feel healthcare, you feel food, you feel utilities, you feel repairs, you feel things that are either regulated, locally constrained, labor-heavy, or structurally undersupplied. And in the US, several of those categories share a common feature. Supply cannot expand quickly. Housing is the clearest example. You can't fix a housing shortage with interest rates alone. If you restrict building through zoning, permitting delays, local opposition, and high input costs, you create a structural scarcity. Scarcity doesn't care about your target inflation number. Scarcity shows up as rent pressure, price pressure, and household stress. Higher rates can cool housing demand by reducing affordability, but they also discourage new construction by raising financing costs for builders. So you get a perverse outcome. Rates go up, buyers back off, but the pipeline of new supply can also slow, keeping underlying shelter pressure alive longer than people expect. That's one reason shelter inflation has this slow, stubborn character. It's not just about demand, it's about supply that was constrained for years and cannot be rebuilt instantly. Now add the labor market. Services inflation is wage inflation with a mask on. When wages rise, service providers raise prices. When wages fall, service prices almost never fall. They just rise more slowly. That's because wage cuts are psychologically and socially difficult, and because many service businesses operate on tight margins where labor is the main cost. And wages in a large, diverse economy like the US are sticky. They adjust down slowly, if at all. Employers would rather freeze hiring, reduce hours, cut bonuses, or slow raises than slash base pay. So services inflation tends to cool slowly as well. This is why the last mile is a grind. You're trying to bring inflation down in categories that behave like slow-moving glaciers, not like fast-moving rivers. Now, I want to address a myth that keeps people confused. People assume that if inflation doesn't return to normal quickly, it must mean policymakers are incompetent or lying. Sometimes policymakers are overly optimistic, yes. Sometimes they simplify, yes. But there's also a mechanical reason inflation can take a long time to return to target, even with serious tightening. It's the lag. Monetary policy works with long and variable lags. That's not a catchphrase. That's an operating reality. Rate changes affect financial conditions first, then lending, then investment, then hiring, then wage growth, then services inflation, then broader inflation measures. And all of that unfolds across quarters, not weeks. And in 2026, you're also dealing with something else. The inflation you are trying to eliminate is partly the echo of past shocks and past policy, not just current conditions. Some components respond quickly, others respond slowly. Some are still reflecting decisions made a year or two ago. So the public watches inflation monthly and asks, why isn't it fixed yet? Well, the system is still digesting what happened over the previous cycles. But even lags are not the real reason. They're only the timing mechanism. The real reason is that inflation is now being supported by three structural pillars in the US, and those pillars don't disappear quickly. Pillar 1, housing scarcity plus shelter measurement lag. Pillar 2, services inflation driven by wages and local constraints. Pillar 3, an underlying policy mix that keeps demand supported while the central bank tries to cool it. When those three pillars exist at the same time, inflation doesn't collapse. It drifts. It grinds. It falls, then stalls, then falls again. And that pattern makes the public feel like inflation is never going back. Now let's talk about the 2026 twist. What happens when inflation cools but stays above target and the economy remains resilient enough that policymakers cannot justify rapid easing? You get a new kind of frustration. The inflation rate is not high in the dramatic sense, but the price level is permanently higher than your memory. People continue to experience a cost of living hangover even when the inflation rate looks respectable. It's like getting over an injury. The acute pain is gone, but the stiffness remains. You can move again, but not like before. You can function, but you feel older than you were. That's what a post-inflation economy feels like. And this is where the phrase back to normal becomes a trap. It implies a return to a previous price level. That's deflation, not disinflation. And deflation is not what central banks aim for, because broad deflation can create debt deflation spirals and deep recessions. So if your definition of normal is 2019 prices with 2026 incomes, that normal is not coming back. Not by policy, not by intention, not unless the economy goes through a severe contraction that forces widespread price declines. And that is not a scenario any policymaker wants. So the public's desired normal and the central bank's desired normal are not the same thing. That mismatch is one of the biggest sources of anger in 2026. Now let's talk about the reason real in the title, the one most people don't want to admit, because it implies the solution is not simple. The reason inflation doesn't return to normal quickly is that the US economy has embedded inflation persistence into its structure through constrained essentials and politically protected spending commitments. In plain English, the things you must buy are the things that adjust slowly and stay expensive. And the system that funds itself through deficits makes it harder to engineer a clean return to 2% without pain. Let's break that down further. Essentials are not optional. You can delay buying a new phone. You can postpone furniture. You can switch brands. But you can't easily opt out of housing. You can't easily opt out of healthcare. You can't easily opt out of insurance. You can't easily opt out of food and energy. And the markets for essentials in the US are not perfectly flexible. They're shaped by regulation, supply constraints, and institutional dynamics. When prices rise, supply often does not surge quickly to meet it. In some cases, supply can barely move at all. So inflation in essentials cools slowly. At the same time, a high-debt environment creates a political bias toward avoiding severe recessions. That doesn't mean there will never be a recession. It means the tolerance for the kind of brutal contraction that would force broad price declines is limited. So the system tends to choose a path of manageable inflation rather than inflation annihilation. And that is the real reason. It's not that policymakers don't know what to do. It's that doing it fully would be too costly, too destabilizing, and too politically explosive. Now, I'm not saying inflation is doomed to stay high forever. I'm saying the path back is likely to be slow and uneven, because the economy is not simply overheating. It's structurally constrained in the areas that matter most. And that brings us to another 2026 factor people underestimate: second-round effects. In the first round, inflation rises because of shocks, supply disruptions, energy spikes, sudden demand surges, policy responses. In the second round, inflation stays elevated because behavior adapts. Workers seek higher wages. Businesses protect margins. Contracts get renegotiated at new baselines. Government programs indexed to inflation become more expensive. The system locks in parts of the inflation. Second round effects are like dye in water. You can stop pouring dye, but it takes time for the water to clear, and some of the color clings to the container. Now add geopolitical and structural factors that have become more prominent in the mid-2020s. Supply chain reconfiguration, strategic reshoring, energy transition costs, and an insurance environment hit by higher risks. Even if you don't want to make grand predictions, it's reasonable to say that the world of cheap everything forever is not returning quickly. When nations prioritize resilience over pure efficiency, costs can rise. When supply chains are made redundant by design, that redundancy can raise prices compared to a hyper-optimized, fragile system. That doesn't guarantee inflation stays high, but it reduces the probability that inflation falls smoothly back to target and stays there without bumps. Now, there's one more piece that makes people feel like inflation isn't normalizing, even when numbers improve. The distribution of inflation. Headline inflation is an average. Your inflation is personal. If the average is pulled down by cheaper goods you don't buy often, but pulled up by essentials you buy constantly, you can experience inflation that feels higher than the official number. That's not paranoia, that's math. A household spending a large share on rent and food experiences inflation differently from a household that owns a home with a fixed mortgage and spends more on discretionary goods. So when someone tells you inflation is basically normal now, and you look at your rent renewal and laugh, you're not crazy. You're living inside a different basket. Now let's talk about what the Federal Reserve actually targets, because this is a subtle but important detail. The Fed's longer-run inflation goal is framed around the PCE price index, not CPI. Those measures differ. They use different weights and formulas. That means the public's most visible inflation number and the central bank's preferred inflation gauge are not identical. The gap isn't enormous, but it matters at the margin, especially when you're talking about the last mile. It also matters because the Fed doesn't just target 2% in a single month. It talks about inflation over time, over the longer run. That gives policymakers flexibility, and flexibility can mean slower normalization if conditions are complex. So even if inflation is above target, if it's moving in the right direction and the economy is balancing on a tightrope, the central bank may prefer patience to shock therapy. Now you can start to see the full picture. Inflation isn't snapping back to normal because the remaining inflation is concentrated in shelter and services. Those categories move slowly. The system has built-in constraints in essentials, and policymakers operate under real-world limits that bias them toward gradualism. That's the diagnosis. Now here's the part most people want next. So what happens in 2026? In 2026, the most likely scenario is not a dramatic inflation resurgence out of nowhere, and not a miraculous return to perfect 2% with prices feeling normal again. The more likely scenario is a messy middle. Inflation trends lower over time, but with annoying stickiness. You get months where progress stalls, you get bursts driven by energy, or insurance, or specific sectors. You get a persistent feeling that the cost of living is rising faster than life is improving. And you get a public that becomes increasingly skeptical of official narratives, not necessarily because the data is fake, but because the lived experience does not match the comfort of averages. Now let's connect this to the emotional reality of households, because that's what your viewers care about. In the inflation shock, the pain is immediate. People feel it fast. Then inflation slows, and economists declare victory. But households don't feel victory. Why? Because wages rarely catch up cleanly. And even when they do, the price level is already higher. It's like running uphill and then being told you should be happy because the hill is slightly less steep. So the frustration persists. And if you want the simplest sentence that explains why inflation doesn't return to normal quickly, it's this. The economy can slow inflation faster than it can restore purchasing power. That's the reason real. Now, what should a person do with this information in a way that's responsible and not sensational? First, stop waiting for yesterday's prices. That's not pessimism, that's clarity. Build your expectations around today's level and tomorrow's risks, not around nostalgia. Second, understand that your best defense against a slow normalization is not predicting the CPI print. Your best defense is increasing your adaptability, your earning power, your optionality, your ability to switch jobs, renegotiate income, reduce fixed costs, and make choices that aren't locked in by debt or rigid commitments. Third, be careful with the stories you accept. In 2026, inflation will be blamed on everything: greed, foreigners, technology, consumers, workers, weather, you name it. Some of those factors matter at the edges, but the core drivers of persistence are structural: housing scarcity, services wages, and the policy mix. If you keep those three in your mind, you'll be harder to fool. And now, as promised, let me tie this into a single framework you can use anytime you hear inflation is returning to normal. Ask three questions. 1. Is shelter inflation actually cooling in a sustained way, or is it lagging the market and keeping the index elevated? 2. Is services inflation slowing because wage pressures are easing, or are wages and prices still chasing each other in the service economy? 3. Is overall demand being meaningfully cooled, Or is it being supported by persistent deficits and strong spending that keep price pressures alive? If the answers are shelter is sticky, services are sticky, and demand is still supported, then inflation normalization will be slow, even if the headline looks better. If the answers shift, shelter cools, services cool, demand cools, then inflation can return closer to target. But the price level still won't rewind to the past. And that's the final truth that people need to hear in 2026, even if it's unpopular. Normal is not a number, it's a feeling, and the feeling will take longer to heal than the chart. Because inflation is not just a rise in prices, it's a shock to trust. Trust in money, trust in planning, trust in the idea that hard work reliably buys stability. And when trust is damaged, it doesn't come back with a single good report. It comes back through repeated evidence over time, through a long stretch of predictable prices and rising real incomes. That is what normal really requires. So when you see inflation not snapping back, don't assume the system is broken in a simple way. Assume the system is adjusting in a complex way. Assume the easy part has already happened. Assume the remaining inflation lives in the slow-moving categories that matter most. And assume the policy constraints of a high-debt, high-commitment economy make quick, painless normalization unlikely. That doesn't mean despair. It means strategy. Inflation may not return to normal quickly, but you can return yourself to stability faster than the macroeconomy returns to comfort by building skills, maintaining flexibility, keeping your costs disciplined, and refusing to be hypnotized by narratives that ignore how inflation actually works. Because once you understand the mechanics, you stop being surprised by the headlines. And in 2026, that might be one of the most valuable advantages you can have.